Part 1. Dr. Oran had studied fear for 300 years. In all that time, across all the species of the galaxy, fear had always been simple. Creatures feared what could kill them. They feared the predators that hunted their ancestors. They feared fire and flood and famine. They feared being alone, cast out from their groups. Fear was a survival tool, nothing more. It kept living things alive long enough to reproduce, and then it faded into the background until it was needed again. Oran had catalogued the nightmares of 412 sentient species. The feared the great sea serpents that had hunted them in their ocean's depths. The feared the sound of cracking ice, a memory of the glacial periods that had nearly driven them to extinction. The feared open spaces because their ancestors had been ambush predators, vulnerable when exposed. Every species had its fears, and every fear made perfect sense when you understood their evolutionary history. The work had become routine. Oran could predict what a species would fear just by studying their planet of origin. Prey animals feared being watched from above. Pack species feared isolation. Burrowing creatures feared being trapped. The patterns were so reliable that the Galactic Institute of Cognitive Phenomena had considered shutting down the department entirely. There was nothing new to discover. Fear was solved. Then the research vessel picked up the human broadcasts. At first, the communications team thought the signals were corrupted. The data made no sense. There were visual recordings of humans being killed by impossible creatures, monsters that clearly did not exist. There were audio files of humans screaming, crying, begging for their lives. There were interactive programs designed to simulate being hunted by things that could not possibly be real. Oran requested copies of everything. The communications team sent over 12,000 files, all carefully labeled with the human terms they had been able to translate. Horror films, scary stories, survival horror games, whatever that meant, haunted houses, true crime, psychological thrillers. Oran spent 6 months reviewing the material. By the end of the first week, the researcher had stopped sleeping properly. By the end of the first month, Oran had requested additional support staff because the workload was simply too vast for one individual. By the end of the 6th month, the department had grown from 3 researchers to 47, and the Galactic Institute had approved the largest emergency grant in its 2,000-year history. The humans were doing something that no other species had ever done. They were creating fear from nothing. This was not supposed to be possible. Fear required a real threat, or at least the memory of a real threat. A species could not be afraid of something that had never existed because there would be no evolutionary pressure to develop that fear. And yet, humans had entire categories of terror that corresponded to nothing in their planet's history. They were afraid of the dead coming back to life, even though this had never happened. They were afraid of demons and spirits and possessions, entities that existed only in their imagination. They were afraid of things that looked almost human but were not quite right, even though their fossil record showed no evidence of any such creature ever existing. They had invented threats to be afraid of. They had manufactured their own terror. Oran called an emergency meeting of the research team. The lead researcher stood before 46 colleagues from 12 different species and tried to explain what they were dealing with. This species does not simply experience fear, Oran said. They cultivate it. They grow it like a crop. They harvest it and refine it and sell it to each other as entertainment. They have turned terror into an art form. A psychologist named raised one of their grasping limbs. Are you saying they are defective, a species-wide dysfunction? No, Oran said. I am saying they have weaponized their own psychology. They have learned to frighten themselves on purpose, and they appear to find value in the experience. The room went silent. Several researchers shifted uncomfortably. The delegation exchanged uneasy glances through their communication membranes. I need volunteers, Oran continued. We must study these materials in depth. We must understand what these humans are doing and why. I warn you now that this work will be disturbing. Some of you may require psychological treatment afterward, But this is the most significant discovery in 3 centuries of nightmare research, and we cannot ignore it. 31 researchers volunteered. Oran assigned them to different categories of human horror and began the systematic analysis. The first major breakthrough came from a psychologist who had been assigned to study human cinema, had been reviewing a genre humans called slasher films when the insight struck. They are not passive observers, explained to the team. When humans watch these recordings, their physiological response is nearly identical to experiencing real danger. Their hearts race, their pupils dilate, their bodies prepare for fight or flight, and yet they know, consciously, that they are in no danger at all. They have found a way to trigger their own fear response without any actual threat. But why? Asked. What possible benefit could there be? I do not know yet, admitted, but I believe they are practicing. The word hung in the air, practicing, as if fear were a skill that could be improved through repetition. Oran assigned additional researchers to investigate this theory. They began studying human children, and what they found was even more disturbing than the adult horror media. Human children were afraid of the dark. This was not unusual in itself. Many species had offspring that feared darkness because predators often hunted at night. But human children were afraid of something specific. They were afraid of things hiding in the dark, things under the bed, things in the closet, things that existed only because the children had imagined them. Human parents did not simply dismiss these fears. They played along. They checked under beds for monsters. They installed small lights to chase away the darkness. They told their children that the imaginary creatures were gone, treating the manufactured threats as if they were real. And the children, in turn, learned to manage their fear. They learned that they could be afraid and still function. They learned that fear did not have to paralyze them. They grew up, and they remembered the monsters they had invented, and they carried those lessons with them into adulthood. They are training their young, Oran said, reading the report with growing amazement. From the moment human children develop consciousness, they begin inventing things to be afraid of. And by facing those invented fears, they build tolerance. They build resistance. They learn to keep thinking even when they are terrified. The research team worked for another 6 months. They cataloged human fears that had no basis in reality. They studied the monsters humans had created, from ancient myths to modern media. They analyzed the chemical responses in human brains when exposed to horror stimuli and compared them to other species. The results were clear. No other species in the galaxy did what humans did. No other species had learned to manufacture fear as a teaching tool. No other species had turned terror into entertainment as a way of building psychological resilience. Oran began writing the preliminary report. The implications were staggering, and the Galactic Council needed to know. But first, the research team needed to understand one more thing. Why had humans developed this ability? What evolutionary pressure had created a species that needed to practice being afraid of impossible things? The answer, when they finally found it, would change everything the galaxy understood about the strange, terrifying, magnificent species called humanity. Part 2. The research team spent another year digging through human history, trying to understand how this species had developed such an unusual relationship with fear. The answer, when it finally came together, was both simple and profound. Humans had no natural predators, not anymore. Oh, there had been threats in their past. Large cats had hunted their distant ancestors. Venomous snakes and spiders had killed them. Disease had swept through their populations. But humans had overcome all of these challenges so quickly, so completely, that their fear response had been left with nothing to do. Other species reached the top of their food chains over millions of years, giving their psychology time to adjust. Humans had done it in a geological instant. One moment they were prey animals, huddling in trees and fearing the dark. The next moment, relatively speaking, They had fire and weapons and organized societies. The predators that had shaped their fears were gone, but the fear remained. And so humans, being humans, had found a new use for it. Presented this theory to the research team with visible excitement. The psychologist had spent months analyzing human folklore and had found patterns that no one else had noticed. Their earliest stories are warnings, explained. Do not go into the forest alone or the wolves will eat you. Do not swim in deep water or the spirits will drown you. Do not trust strangers because they might be monsters in disguise. These are practical survival lessons dressed up as entertainment. That is common among developing species, said. They have similar traditions. Yes, but watch what happens next. Change the display to show a timeline of human cultural development. As humans became more advanced, the practical threats disappeared. They killed the wolves. They learned to swim. They built walls to keep strangers out. But they did not stop telling scary stories. Instead, they invented new monsters to replace the old ones. The timeline showed the progression clearly. Ancient humans feared animals and natural disasters. Medieval humans feared demons and witches. Industrial humans feared technology turning against them. Modern humans feared everything from alien invasions to artificial intelligence. They kept inventing new threats, said, because they needed to keep practicing. Their fear response demanded exercise, so they created things to be afraid of. And with each new monster they invented, they were really asking themselves a question. What would we do if this were real? How would we survive? Oran found this insight fascinating, but there was still more to understand. The lead researcher had been studying a particular subset of human horror that seemed to defy explanation. It was called cosmic horror, and it was unlike anything else in the galaxy. The researcher who had coined the term had been a human named, who had lived approximately 200 years ago by Earth's calendar. His stories described entities so vast and alien that the human mind could not comprehend them. Reality itself was unstable in his fictional universe. Knowledge was dangerous because learning the truth about existence would drive a person insane. Other horror could be understood as practice for specific threats. Monsters taught humans to be brave. Ghost stories taught them to face death. Survival horror taught them to keep thinking under pressure. But cosmic horror seemed to teach a different lesson entirely. This genre suggests that the universe is fundamentally hostile, Oran said to the team. It suggests that there are things beyond human understanding, and that encountering them would be catastrophic. Why would any species tell itself such stories? A young researcher named Doctor, one of the few non-senior members of the team, offered an answer. Perhaps they are preparing for the genuinely unknown, not specific threats, but the category of things they cannot predict. Oran considered this. It was a disturbing thought. Most species assumed that anything they encountered could eventually be understood. Science and reason would explain even the strangest phenomena given enough time. But humans had invented an entire genre of fear based on the idea that some things might be permanently beyond comprehension. They were inoculating themselves against the truly alien. The research team decided to test this theory. They created a simulation, approved by the ethics board, that would expose volunteers from various species to an incomprehensible stimulus. The volunteers would be shown something that deliberately their understanding, something designed to trigger the fear of the unknown. The results were dramatic. Volunteers entered a state of protective catatonia within seconds. Their minds simply shut down, retreating from a threat they could not process. Volunteers became violent, lashing out blindly at anything nearby. Volunteers froze completely, their higher brain functions suspending until the stimulus was removed. Then they tested humans. The human volunteers were frightened. Their physiological responses confirmed this. Their hearts raced, their skin conducted more electricity, and stress hormones flooded their systems. But they did not shut down. They did not become violent or frozen. They kept looking. They kept trying to understand. One human volunteer, a woman named Dr. Sarah, actually laughed. "That's some nonsense right there," she said, still staring at the incomprehensible stimulus. "Okay, so I can't understand it. That doesn't mean I can't deal with it. What are my options? Can I leave? Can I destroy it? Can I contain it? Can I just ignore it and go about my day?" The researchers monitoring the experiment watched in amazement as Doctor systematically worked through possible responses to something that should have been psychologically devastating. She was afraid, yes, but she was also thinking. "How is this possible?" asked, reviewing the data afterward. Her fear response was just as strong as anyone else's. How did she continue functioning? "Practice," Oran said. "She has been practicing her whole life. Every horror movie she watched, every scary story she read, every nightmare she had as a child. She has encountered the incomprehensible so many times in fiction that she had a framework ready for encountering it in reality." The implications were staggering. Humans had accidentally created the perfect psychological defense system. By inventing monsters and exposing themselves to terror, they had built up a tolerance that no other species possessed. They could be afraid and still function. They could face the unknown and keep thinking. The research team spent 6 more months confirming their findings. They tested more humans and more alien volunteers. They analyzed brain scans and psychological profiles. They reviewed thousands of hours of human horror media and traced the evolution of human fears across their entire recorded history. The conclusion was inescapable. Humans were unique in the galaxy. They were the only species that had learned to manufacture terror and use it as a tool for psychological development. But there was one more question that needed answering. What did this mean for the rest of the galaxy? Oran began preparing the final report for the Galactic Council. The lead researcher had a feeling that this discovery would change everything. The galaxy had always seen humanity as a young, aggressive, somewhat chaotic species. They were interesting, certainly, but not particularly remarkable compared to the ancient civilizations that had been traveling the stars for millions of years. That assessment, Oran now realized, had been catastrophically wrong. The humans were not just another species struggling to find their place in the galaxy. They were something new, something unprecedented, a species that had accidentally evolved the most powerful psychological defense mechanism the galaxy had ever seen. And if the Council did not understand what that meant, Oran would make sure they did. The fate of the galaxy might depend on it. Part 3. The Galactic Council chamber was filled when Oran arrived to present the final report. Representatives from 73 species sat in their designated sections, each adapted to their particular environmental needs. The floated in their water tanks, the hung from specialized perches, the stood on platforms heated to their preferred temperature. Oran had requested this full assembly because the findings were too important for a simple written report. The Council needed to understand what the research team had discovered, and they needed to understand it now. "Honored representatives," Oran began, "I come before you today to discuss a species most of you consider unremarkable. Humans have been part of the galactic community for only 2 centuries. They are young. They are primitive by many standards. They have fought wars among themselves within living memory. Many of you have dismissed them as a passing curiosity, a species that will either mature or destroy themselves before becoming relevant." Several representatives made sounds of agreement. The general attitude toward humanity had always been one of mild condescension. "I am here to tell you that this assessment is wrong, dangerously wrong. The humans possess an ability that no other known species has developed, and that ability may be the most valuable trait in the galaxy." Oran activated the display, showing data from years of research. Charts, graphs, brain scans, behavioral analyses. The representatives watched with varying degrees of interest. "Every sentient species experiences fear," This is universal. Fear keeps us alive. It warns us of danger and prepares us to respond. But fear also has a weakness. When we encounter something truly unexpected, something beyond our experience and understanding, fear overwhelms us. It stops us from thinking. It reduces us to our most basic instincts. The display showed the results of the incomprehensible stimulus experiments. Volunteers in catatonic states, becoming violent, frozen and helpless. This is the normal response. This is what evolution has given us. Fear protects us from known dangers, but it paralyzes us when we face the unknown. Every species here has this vulnerability. Every species except one. The display changed to show the human volunteers. Their fear responses were just as strong as everyone else's, but they kept functioning. They kept thinking. They kept trying to solve the problem. Humans have developed something unprecedented. They have learned to manufacture their own terror. They create monsters that do not exist. They tell stories designed to frighten themselves. They pay currency to experience simulated fear. And in doing so, they have built a tolerance that makes them resistant to psychological collapse. Oran paused, letting the implications sink in. When a warrior encounters something beyond their comprehension, their mind protects itself by shutting down. When a scientist faces the truly unknown, they become violent and irrational. When a philosopher confronts something impossible, they freeze until the threat is removed. But when a human encounters these same stimuli, they remain functional. They are afraid, yes, but they keep thinking. They keep planning. They keep acting. A representative from the delegation spoke up. This is interesting from a scientific perspective, but why does it matter to the council? What practical relevance does this have? Oran had been waiting for this question. It matters because the galaxy is not safe. We like to pretend that we have explored most of known space, that we understand the universe we live in. But we have only scratched the surface. There are things out there that we have not yet encountered. Things that will challenge our understanding of reality. Things that will trigger exactly the kind of overwhelming fear that paralyzes most species. The chamber grew quiet. This was not a comfortable topic, but it was true. The galaxy was vast, and there were regions that remained unexplored. There were phenomena that explanation. There were ancient structures of unknown origin and signals from beyond the edge of map space. When we encounter something truly alien, Oran continued, something that our minds were not built to comprehend, most of us will be helpless. Our crews will collapse. Our scientists will be unable to function. Our military forces will be paralyzed by terror they cannot overcome. Oran let that image settle before delivering the key point. But the humans will keep thinking, because they have been practicing for this their entire existence. Every horror story they told, every monster they invented, every nightmare they forced themselves to experience was preparation for the genuinely unknown. They have been training themselves, generation after generation, to face things that should be impossible to face. The council chamber erupted in discussion. Representatives argued among themselves about the implications. Some dismissed the findings as exaggeration. Others began to see the strategic significance. The representative raised a limb for attention. Are you suggesting that we should include humans in all first contact scenarios, that we should rely on them to face the unknown on our behalf? I am suggesting, Oran said carefully, that we have been underestimating humanity since the moment we encountered them. They are not just another young species. They are specialists in facing terror. They have turned fear itself into a tool, and they have been sharpening that tool for thousands of years. The discussion continued for hours. Eventually, the council reached a consensus. Humanity would be reclassified as a species of strategic significance. Human representatives would be included in all deep space exploration missions. Human consultants would be brought in to help other species develop their own psychological resilience programs. Oran watched the vote with satisfaction. The research had taken years, but it had been worth it. The galaxy now understood something important about the strange, terrifying, magnificent humans. After the session ended, a human observer approached Iran. Dr. Sarah, the same woman who had laughed during the incomprehensible stimulus experiment, had been allowed to watch the proceedings. "Thank you," she said, "for taking us seriously. Most species just see us as aggressive and chaotic." "You are aggressive and chaotic," Iran agreed. "But you are also something more. You have solved a problem that no other species has even recognized as a problem. You have learned to be afraid without being controlled by fear." Doctor smiled. "We've had a lot of practice. Thousands of years of telling each other scary stories around the fire. I never thought about it as training before, but I suppose it makes sense. We've been imagining the worst-case scenarios for so long that the actual worst cases don't seem so bad." Oran found this perspective fascinating. "Do you not find it strange that your species invented monsters to frighten yourselves?" "Maybe a little," Doctor admitted. "But honestly, I think we just get bored when things are too safe. We need challenges even if we have to make them up. And fear is one of the most powerful challenges there is. Facing it, overcoming it, that's how we grow." The human paused, looking out at the now empty council chamber. "Besides, there's something satisfying about looking at something terrifying and saying, 'Yeah, I've seen worse.' Even if the worst thing was just a movie I watched as a teenager. The feeling of not being paralyzed, of still being able to think and act, that's worth all the sleepless nights the scary stories caused." Oran considered this. The lead researcher had studied fear for 3 centuries and had never thought about it as something to be sought out and conquered. Fear was an obstacle, a limitation, something to be avoided when possible. But humans had turned it into something else. They had made it a test, a challenge, a way to prove their own strength. It was, Oran reflected, very human. In the years that followed, the galaxy benefited enormously from this new understanding of humanity. Human crews were stationed on exploration vessels, ready to provide psychological support when the crews encountered something beyond their comprehension. Human consultants helped other species develop their own horror media, carefully calibrated to build tolerance without causing harm. Human children's stories were translated into dozens of languages, teaching young aliens that it was possible to be afraid and still keep thinking. Not everyone appreciated these changes. Some species found human horror media too disturbing and banned it from their worlds. Others resented being told that they needed help from a species they had once considered inferior. But the evidence was clear. Missions that included human crew members had dramatically higher success rates when encountering unknown phenomena. Species that adopted human psychological resilience techniques showed measurable improvements in their ability to handle stress and uncertainty. And somewhere, in research facilities across the galaxy, scientists began working on the next great question. If humans had accidentally developed the perfect psychological defense system through horror media, what other accidental advantages might they have? What other human quirks and cultural artifacts might prove to be invaluable in ways no one had ever expected? The galaxy had spent 2 centuries underestimating humanity. It was time to take a closer look at what else these strange, terrifying, magnificent creatures might teach the stars.